Muy buenos días, bienvenidos todos a esta tercera edición de Arquitectour. Estamos acá en todas las señales de la W Radio, a través de nuestro Facebook, a través de nuestro canal de YouTube. Estamos también a través de nuestra página wradio.com.co. Les repito, es la tercera edición anual de Arquitectour. Hoy con nuestro primer conversatorio, vamos a ir desde hoy 6 de julio y hasta el día 16. Les recuerdo, es un evento completamente gratuito. Ustedes van a poder acceder después a todos estos conversatorios que van a quedar alojados en nuestra página en wradio.com.co/arquitectura, también en la página construccionesplanificadas.com/arquitectura. Ahí van a quedar estos conversatorios para que ustedes los puedan ver. Por supuesto, la invitación a toda la academia, las universidades de Colombia, los estudiantes de arquitectura, para que se unan, para que nos acompañen. Son arquitectos muy reconocidos a nivel mundial. Vamos a estar desde Estados Unidos, desde Italia, desde Portugal, por supuesto arquitectos también colombianos. Un gran evento que Construcciones Planificadas y el Grupo Aval ha querido desarrollar junto a la W Radio esta tercera edición, toda de manera virtual, con lo cual es aún más fácil para todos poder acceder. Les recuerdo nuestro canal de YouTube es W Radio Colombia. En Facebook también nos encuentran como W Radio Colombia, y más fácil aún en nuestra página www.wradio.com.co. Para arrancar con este primer conversatorio y para que nos cuente un poco más de lo que es Arquitectour y lo que tiene para todos nosotros este año, está con nosotros Mauricio Patiño. Él es el gerente general de Construcciones Planificadas, organizador de este evento, quien además, por supuesto, nos presentará nuestro primer invitado en esta serie de conversatorios. Serán 7 en total. Mauricio, muy buenos días. Bienvenido al canal de YouTube de la W, al Facebook de W Radio y a nuestra página wradio.com.co. Nuestros oyentes, hoy televidentes, están muy pendientes de este evento, y cuéntanos un poco qué nos trae Arquitectour este año, Mauricio.
Buenos días, Andrés. Muchas gracias por la presentación. Muy contentos de estar en este tercer año de Arquitectour 2021, el cual creemos que va a ser una edición fenomenal, con 7 figuras, como decías, de la arquitectura mundial de talla mundial. El arquitecto de hoy, que en un momento se los estaré presentando. El día de mañana tendremos a João Nunes, arquitecto portugués paisajista. El 8 de julio, como consecuencia del Día del Diseño Italiano, tendremos al arquitecto Fabrizio Barozzi con un día muy especial alrededor de toda la arquitectura italiana. Nos acompañará también el relator Giancarlo Massanti ese día, que es un arquitecto colombo-italiano, donde veremos algo muy especial. El 9 de julio, el viernes 9 de julio, tendremos a Lorenzo Castro, gran arquitecto colombiano, urbanista, donde nos acompañará y mostrará un poco de esa arquitectura que ha desarrollado durante los últimos años. El lunes 12 de julio tendremos al arquitecto español Emilio Tuñón, el cual nos acompañará a mostrar 3 proyectos magníficos en que está trabajando actualmente. El 14 de julio tendremos a la arquitecta italiana radicado en Barcelona, Benedetta Tagliabue. Y el 16 de julio, como remate, tendremos al arquitecto de Irán, que es actualmente el profesor de la Universidad de Harvard, Raúl Merot. Entonces, eso es un poco, Andrés, ese preámbulo de Arquitectour que tendremos este año, y muy contentos de cómo vamos a interactuar este año y cómo cambiamos un poco el formato de Arquitectour para enriquecerlo aún más de lo que tuvimos el año pasado.
Pues Mauricio, yo diría que adelante, arranquemos. Cuéntenos usted quién es nuestro primer invitado en este conversatorio. Le tengo que decir a quienes nos están escuchando y oyendo a esta hora que se trata de un arquitecto norteamericano, por lo tanto su presentación será en inglés, para que ustedes la puedan seguir. Él, digamos, es muy claro en sus explicaciones, todo el tema, pero la vamos a hacer en inglés. Y por supuesto, todos la pueden seguir a través de YouTube y de Facebook. Mauricio, ¿de quién se trata?
Muchas gracias, Andrés. También recordarles que este es un evento totalmente gratuito. Todas las conferencias van a quedar grabadas en la página de la W. Por si alguien que se perdió la conferencia la puede repetir en cualquier momento durante los próximos días, inclusive los próximos años. Como dijo Andrés, esta conferencia va a ser en inglés, entonces doy el paso, digamos, a dar esta inicio y esta introducción a nuestro arquitecto de hoy. It's an honor for me to have our today architect. Stan Allen is an architect, and George Dutton, 27 professor of architecture of Princeton University. In 1991, he established an independent practice and since that time has pursued parallel careers as architect, educator, and writer. He has taught at Harvard, Columbia, and Princeton, and served as Dean of the School of Architecture at Princeton. From 2002 to 2012, his practice, Stan Allen Architects, have realized building and urban projects in the United States, South America, and Asia, responding to the complexity of the modern city in creative ways. Stan Allen has developed an extensive catalog of innovative design strategies, in particular looking at field theory, landscape architecture, and ecology as model to revitalize the practice of architecture. Parallel to this large-scale work, he has recently completed a number of privileged houses and artist studios of rural sites of the Hudson River Valley. Welcome to Arquitectour, Stanley.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, to take advantage of one of the few positives we might take from the whole COVID experience, which is the ability to bring together people from all over the world for events like this. So I'm very happy to be part of this program, and I will go ahead and share my screen, and we can start with the presentation. So okay, so everything visible, good, no? Okay, so the title of the lecture is Situated Objects, which is also the title of a book which was published last year by Park Books in Zurich, which brings together the work of the past 6 or 7 years in my practice, and it represents somewhat of a change from the larger scale work dealing with landscape and urbanism to focus on small scale projects in the landscape. My larger concern is the relationship between architecture and landscape in, I would say, from my point of view, specifically the North American context, but I think I would include the Americas in general in that context. Both the actual reality of the landscape and, as you see in this beautiful photograph by Stephen Shore, the representation of the landscape. Now, this remark by Alexander von Humboldt from more than 200 years ago, when he visited the Americas, really does speak to a changed relationship between landscape and culture in the New World. And I think this does apply to North and South America together, and specifically to the context where I've been working in the past 6 to 7 years, which is the Hudson River Valley north of New York City, which is known primarily in this country for the School of Painting in the late 19th century, the Hudson River School painters. So this is a painting by Frederick Edwin Church, who was himself a follower of Humboldt, read Humboldt's readings very, very, very carefully, and in fact, traveled to South America and painted Mount Chimborazo. So he really literally followed in the footsteps of Humboldt. Now, the painting was done in 1846. He's depicting something that took place in 1636. So very, very early in the history of the European settlement of this continent. And it's the journey of the Reverend Frederick Hooker, who was a dissident Puritan minister, from Plymouth, Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to Hartford, Connecticut, which at that time was wilderness. We don't think of Hartford, Connecticut as wilderness today, but it was certainly wilderness in 1636. And the Puritans at the Massachusetts Bay Colony were themselves refugees from religious persecution. But Hooker found that he was in disagreement with some of the precepts of the colonists in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and in particular, their requirements, very strict requirements for voting. He had a broader, more democratic vision. And he set out with a group of followers, 100 followers, and in fact, founded the state of Connecticut. What you see in the distance is the Connecticut River, the sun setting, the sense of promise and openness that belongs to the American landscape. This connection between the landscape and descent, in a way, the idea of promise and possibility, the possibility of reinventing oneself by traveling through the wilderness to this vast open landscape, which I think is shared by North and South America as distinct from Europe. Now, how does architecture fit into this? This is a building from somewhat later, from around the beginning of the 19th century in Maine. And I think there are a number of things which I have sort of learned from this architecture. I would say the tautness of the skin, the compactness of the geometry. I love the play of symmetry here. The chimney being offset to one side, the doorway offset to the other. That seems to represent, for me, the architectural analog to those qualities of the landscape, the compactness, the tightness of the eaves, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, the use of balloon framing that gives this taut skin-like character to the building. So the book, Situated Objects, is about architecture in relationship to the landscape. And it's about architecture, it's about buildings in relationship to other buildings and the space between buildings. Now, so this is the organization of the book and the cover, beautifully printed by Park Books in Germany. And as you see, organized into three categories: outbuildings, material histories, and new natures, with texts interweaved through there. Now, those of you who know my background and my work will hear a certain resonance between situated objects and field conditions. This on your right is, in fact, the Swedish translation of the article From Object to Field. So what does it mean to go from field conditions to situated objects? Now, this is a description that I like very much from Sanford Quinter about the idea of the field. But I think one of the things that's important is to note here, he says, the field contains no matter or material points, rather functions, vectors, and speeds. This is a bit of a problem for an architect, because as architects, we deal with matter and material, not simply relationships. So in the work that I've done that follows through the notion of field conditions, such as our 2016 contribution to the American Pavilion and the Venice Biennale, this idea of part-to-whole relationships, of the aggregation of many small pieces, was sort of fundamental to playing out the notion of field conditions. But it's important to say that all along, parallel to that larger scale work in landscape and urbanism, there was always an interest in small scale works and, you could say, objects. So the Sagaponack House on the right, which is a sort of predecessor to the work that's collected in in situated objects, and a project on the left that again works with this figural and iconic sense of the building on the landscape. So I'm certainly not going to work you through this long, complicated chart, but this really lays out the movement from the early speculations around field conditions in the 90s, the move to landscape urbanism and the collaboration with James Corner, 1998, the book Landform Buildings, in which we published work by Giancarlo Mazzanti, the idea that architecture is geological in character as much as it's biological. And that leading to a kind of rethinking of the field conditions idea, and then in turn to situated objects. So this project done in 2010 is an important hinge point where the part-to-whole relationships that belong to field conditions are still in operation, but the language of the parts, the pentagonal plan, the profile of the building on the landscape are looking forward to the work that characterizes the situated objects books. So what I'm going to do in the time remaining, because I want to stay on time, is very quickly show a few projects from each of the three categories of the situated objects book. So Outbuildings talks about the relationship between buildings. So it's not about an isolated building on the landscape, but a landscape that has been occupied and inhabited over time. Buildings have been added over time, and it's the relationship between buildings and landscape and the space between buildings that becomes important. So this is actually a very interesting example. The part of the project to your right was completed around 2000 for an artist and her husband north of New York City. And then in 2012, they came to me with a project to add on to the building to create a studio. And it was also an opportunity to rework the landscape. So again, the notion of situated objects speaks to the relationship, in this case, between the older part of the project on the right and the new part of the project on the left, and the engagement with the landscape that you see with the walls and the terraces and the courtyards and so on. So the other thing that's important to say, all of the photographs in the book were taken by a single photographer, a very talented photographer named Scott Benedict, who works up in the Hudson River Valley. So there's a kind of consistency in the use of black and white, which for me minimizes the distractions of color and calls attention to the textural relationships between the natural characteristics of the site and the architecture itself. So you in other words, in Scott's photographs, you always see the architecture through the lens of nature. Here's the plan, the studio to the right and the existing house to the left. Here, again, existing house to the right, studio to the left. Always, you know, this notion of a geological architecture, it seems to me, is brought home here with the rocks in the foreground and the faceted crystalline form of the studio to the left. You see the interior of the studio and the geometry of the roof and the geometry of the roof in the landscape. Second project is also an artist studio. This one is in not in the Hudson River Valley, but in the Blue Hills of Virginia. And it's also for a client who I'd worked with before. On the right, you see a house that I built for this client in Glendale, California, also around 2000. And on the left, the landscape that the project is located in. And once again, there is a relationship between an existing building and a new construction, this time across a courtyard in the middle. The studio here is on the left. Here's a model of the studio. Notice the courtyard and the retaining walls to the right. So the site sloped quite steeply. So there are 8-foot-high retaining walls in concrete that deal with the slope of the site. And then a lightweight structure is dropped down on top of that to create the space of the studio. So here you see from the back, and you see the way in which those walls of the studio are holding back the landscape and creating this relationship between the object and the landscape. So you see the landscape retaining walls on the right, you see the entry to the studio on your left. Materiality here is very important. The concrete of the retaining walls below and concrete board above. So same material used in a different textural. This is a photograph of the interior of the studio before it was inhabited. Concrete floors, simple white walls, beautiful light for a working artist. And we worked with a very talented landscape architect who really knitted the spaces, interior and exterior spaces of the studio into the landscape itself. Now, I mentioned the question of the balloon frame. This was, again, an American invention. The idea of replacing the heavy timbers that had come from European construction with machine-made, pre-cut lumber, lightweight materials, something more sort of basket-like. So for our submission to the Chicago Biennial, we wanted to look at the logic of the balloon frame, which in fact, at a certain point, came to be called the Chicago frame, and had again, an intimate relationship to the American landscape. Not only was the lumber taken from the forests of Wisconsin and Upper Michigan, but because these buildings could be built quickly and in fact even moved around, they were fundamental to the settlement of the American West. So here the idea is to take a single unit like the Maribor Art Gallery project and repeat it to create a larger sense of the collective. So here the project is for a small school. This was exhibited in the Biennial at Chicago in 2017. And you see the individual spaces and the way they're linked together, and the visible balloon frame construction. Here, a view of an interior classroom and a cutaway showing, in this case, the relationship to the open landscape of the American Midwest. Now, the final category is what I call new natures, which is to say that given the vastness and the extent of the American landscape, and in some ways a critique, I would say, of the Hudson River School's approach to landscape that saw landscape very much through the filter of representation and images, it seems to me, particularly in a post-digital age, that our relationship to landscape is much more immersive, that landscape is something we inhabit. It's not something we primarily look at. So these last two projects deal with that notion of a kind of extensive, immersive landscape space that can be much a property of the interior as a property of the building as an object. And again, there's a story here that has to do with working with an existing context. I did not design this building. This building was designed by a New York architect in collaboration with an artist for his studio, and it was built in the mid-1980s. It's a kind of fascinating building, sort of weird mixture of Aldo Rossi and John Haydick. And my clients bought this house and asked me to enlarge the house, create a new living space, but also because they were art collectors, they wanted space to exhibit their art collection. So it sits, again, on this Hudson River landscape with beautiful trees and views. These are some of the drawings, the original 1988 drawings of the existing house, this weird, quirky wood box with the skylight roofs. And in thinking about how we would add on to this, initially we were working again with a more figural language, as you see in these models. But we finally decided that there was enough figural energy in the serrated roof of the existing building, and we would complement it better with a kind of neutral box, which is the scheme that we built that you see there on the right. So there's a view of the addition to your right and an axonometric cutaway that shows a little bit the logic of the project. The opening up of the living space down below, a new bedroom up above, and in the second floor of the existing house, a new gallery. This is a very intricate project, even though it looks very, very simple. The construction was really quite intricate. We had to add quite a bit of steel. Here you see under construction, shoring up the existing building in order to seamlessly insert this new addition underneath. And then here you see the textures of the new addition. And the open space of the new ground floor, very clean, very, very empty, waiting, in fact, at that point for the art. And then here on the second floor, the large, what had been the artist studio is converted to a gallery, and the bedroom is added on the right. So here is a photograph of the gallery. Again, it's photographed empty at this point, but you get a feel for this sort of immersive space of the interior that complements the nature outside here in both photograph and a perspective. So here you see the older building in the foreground and the addition to the right, and the way in which we've sort of knit these two together to create this kind of uncanny object that occupies the site. So there's an internal conversation between the old and the new in the building, as well as a conversation between the interior space and the landscape and the site beyond. So the last project, in a sense, closes the circle with Frederick Church, the painting that I showed at the beginning of the lecture. This is a proposal for an exhibition. This was 2019, invited by Barry Bergdahl to contribute to an exhibition that took place on the property called Olana, which was the estate that the painter Frederick Church built in the late 19th century in the Hudson River Valley. So on the left, you see Church's sketch of the site and the atmospheric quality of the clouds, and on the right, a photograph of the house which he designed and built on that site. So Barry Bergdahl asked a number of architects to make proposals for Olana that would speak to the relationship between architecture and landscape and ecology in the present. Our proposal was, so rather than occupy the hill in a very dominant way, the way that Church did, we wanted to site our project here on the site of the working farm that had been the original settlement of Olana. This is a site plan drawn by Frederick Church's son. The Hudson River would be towards the top of your screen, the views, whereas the part of the site that we're occupying is a working farm. So we're making a very explicit relationship here between the proposal, which was for an artist's residency, studios, and workspace for artists. So we would bring back to this site the presence of working artists. And here you see, in relationship to the productive landscape of the orchard and the man-made geometries applied to the natural landscape of the orchard. Now, on the right, you see a diagram of the formal logic of the project. It's a highly figural plan condition, which is then cut with a very consistent sawtooth roof, which yields, as you see on the right, a certain complexity. So it's a very simple algorithm that yields a kind of complexity that you see there on the right because of the figural character of the plan. Here you see the logic of the skylights and the structural trusses, and the assembly diagram for the exhibition model. So here is another closer image of the site and the relationship between the building and the orchard and the edge of the forest, and a cutaway axonometric. The idea again here is to create a kind of immersive space with the light coming primarily from above. In fact, part of the logic of the curved walls is that the delineation of the space is not so strict and definite, but again becomes much more kind of immersive. So and no partitions or divisions, but simply objects set down within that figural plan space lit by the skylights from above, so that the landscape that you see from this space is the atmospheric landscape of the sky, the clouds, and the stars, rather than the pictorial landscape that belonged to the Hudson River Valley. So another view of the model that was exhibited and the way this geometry works. Here, an interior view of the skylights and the sort of empty galleries. And finally, an image of the orchard of our project and Church's house on the crest of the hill, in dialogue with our project down below. So at that point, I'm happy to take questions. I know we want to allow as much time as possible for discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stanley. Thank you so much. Bueno, vamos a ir con una serie de preguntas antes para nuestros oyentes que estaban pendientes y tal vez la biografía, porque Mauricio nos contó un poco de quién es Stan Allen. Quiero contarles para quienes no hablan inglés, Stan es un arquitecto, profesor en la Universidad de Princeton en los Estados Unidos, ha enseñado también en Harvard, muy reconocido, con trabajos en los Estados Unidos, en Sudamérica y en Asia, y es nuestro invitado de hoy. Les recuerdo que esta presentación y todas van a quedar alojadas en nuestra página www.radio.com.co/Arquitectour, también en nuestro canal de YouTube y también en Facebook, para que ustedes pues los puedan seguir, las puedan ver todas las veces que quieran. Además es completamente gratuito. Tenemos hoy con nosotros un par de relatores, arquitectos también reconocidos, uno de ellos español, el otro barranquillero, precisamente para que sean ellos los que puedan charlar un poco con Stan, plantearle algunas preguntas sobre su trabajo y sobre la presentación que han hecho. El primero de ellos es Giancarlo Massanti, muy reconocido en nuestro país, barranquillero, con estudios de posgrado en diseño industrial y arquitectura en Italia, en Florencia, que mejor escuela que la italiana, además experiencia académica, profesor invitado de cátedra en numerosas universidades colombianas, también en universidades de prestigio mundial como Harvard, como Columbia, como Princeton. Es el primer arquitecto colombiano en tener sus obras en la colección permanente del MoMA en la ciudad de Nueva York y del reconocido Centro Pompidou en París. Y está también con nosotros Lucas Ariza Parrado. Él nació en Chiclana de la Frontera, en la provincia de Cádiz, en España, arquitecto de la Escuela Técnica Superior de Arquitectura de la Universidad de Sevilla, maestría en la Universidad de los Andes, en Bogotá, Colombia, profesor asistente, editor de la revista de ARC, del Departamento de Arquitectura de esta misma universidad, la Universidad de los Andes. En el 2008 comienza su aventura y su romance con Latinoamérica, que hasta el momento dura, con continuos ires y venires que siguen armándole un panorama rico, complejo y contradictorio. También recientemente ha publicado un libro fruto de la investigación realizada en su maestría titulado El Temple de la Arquitectura. Sin más introducciones, Lucas, Giancarlo, yo les cedo la palabra para que ustedes puedan charlar con Stanley. Él nos ha dicho, él entiende el español muy bien, lo que pasa es que no se animaba a hacer la presentación en español, pero él entiende el español perfecto y él nos responderá en inglés. Cualquier duda, pues aquí estaremos para darles una mano con la traducción. Así que, Lucas, no sé si tú quieres arrancar y conversando con Stanley después de esta magnífica presentación aquí en Arquitectura.
Claro que sí. Muy buenos días, Andrés, Mauricio. Muchísimas gracias por esta invitación. Gracias también en nombre de la Facultad de Arquitectura y Diseño de la Universidad de los Andes. Es sin duda un placer y un honor hacer parte de estas conversaciones que son tan importantes y yo creo que tan necesarias para nuestra disciplina. Muchísimas gracias. Yo creo que la presentación que hemos visto ha sido maravillosa, ¿no? Además, muy concreta, cosa que necesitamos también aprender de Stan, lo sintético que ha sido para mostrarnos su trabajo reciente, su publicación reciente. Yo quiero empezar, o me gustaría empezar, haciéndole una pregunta muy concreta también a Stan, que me llama la atención en lo que hemos visto, y es la variedad de recursos utilizados durante la representación del proyecto, en la representación del proyecto. Y concretamente me llama la atención uno en particular, que son estas axonometrías como a 90 grados cortadas, que me parece que son un recurso muy llamativo, en cierta medida, porque es un dibujo muy técnico, muy preciso, muy científico, pero al mismo tiempo tiene unas condiciones casi que pictóricas, digamos, muy llamativas y muy ricas, ¿no? Entonces me gustaría preguntarle a Stan si estos dibujos son valiosos para él mientras que está pensando su arquitectura, o es una cuestión que sobre todo a la hora de comunicarla, cuando quiere contárnosla a los demás.
It's a perfect question, really. And just one clarification to make sure I understood the question perfectly. So there are two kinds of axonometrics. There are the 90-degree projections, but you also mentioned the sectioned axonometrics, correct? And again, I think that there's an important distinction there. But basically, you articulated perfectly what for me is the value of the axonometric, which is it's simultaneously measurable, precise. It is, I think, the architect's drawing in a kind of ideal sense for that reason. That if, perspective, I think, is always associated with painting and with the pictorial language, the axonometric with the technical disciplines. So that combination of measurability, constructability, but with the production of an image is the power of the axonometric. And I think that's why the axonometric is so important for architects. Now, two things, again, because we don't want to use up too much time. The flat axonometric is of course something which belongs to my history. I was a student of John Haydick at the Cooper Union in the 1980s, and there's a whole sort of idea that has to do with those drawings about cubist space and simultaneity and the flattening of the sort of push-pull of surface and depth, which is important to me. But you also mentioned the sectional axonometrics and specifically those from below, which of course come from Choisy. And that to me is I think, as you said, it's a more technical drawing because you can show the construction in the section, but also I have this intuition that in a complex space, the roof is more of a defining element than the floor. And that idea that when you're looking from below, which is a highly abstract drawing, nobody can actually occupy that point of view, right? That the defining spatial properties of the roof become clear. That's of course why Choisy was interested in them. So, and then finally, so all of the drawings in the book were made really for the publication and worked and reworked. But in many cases, they were the reworking of drawings which we used during the design process. So we do use a lot of axonometrics and cut axonometrics in the studio during the design process. But they're not as finished and polished as the ones that you see in the presentation in the book.
Thank you, Stan. Don Giancarlo Massanti, profesor Massanti, le cedo la palabra a usted para que pueda preguntarle a nuestro invitado, a Stanley. Antes, recordarles que estamos en YouTube y saludar a toda la gente que está conectada a esta hora, porque nos están saludando, quieren saludar también al profesor Stanley. Veo que algunos de sus exalumnos están allí. Plutarco Rojas, Héctor Saúl Quintana, María Paula Farfán, Patricia Vargas, dice Bogotá, arquitecta y diseñadora de iluminación, Julián Andrés, de Arquitect SAS, Edison Molina, desde la Universidad de Boyacá, también desde la Universidad del Sinú, en Montería, nos están saludando y están conectados con nosotros. Francisco Vázquez desde Medellín, Héctor Hernández, Bluestone, organización en New York, Anta Holmes, José Pozo, Juan Carlos Barbosa, Elsa Cortés, en fin, mucha gente conectada. Ya en un momento vamos a tratar de leer también algunas de las preguntas que nos están llegando a través de YouTube y de Facebook para nuestro invitado. Giancarlo, le cedo la palabra a usted. Lo escucha Stan para que conversen un poco sobre esta magnífica presentación que él nos ha hecho.
Andrés, muchas gracias. Stan, es un placer verte siempre y oír tus conferencias en general. Yo tengo una gran admiración por el trabajo de Stan, no solamente por lo que acaba de mostrar en su obra construida, sino su gran capacidad de construir una obra en pensamiento. Tiene grandes libros de una importancia en mi obra que han sido importantes en mi obra, como Points and Lines, Land for Building, una serie de libros, y tiene un trabajo teórico detrás de su proyecto importante. Y hacia esto va un poco mi pregunta. O sea, ¿cuál es la diferencia para él entre pensar, hacer, entre escribir y diseñar? Y entender un poco más cuál es el rol actual de un arquitecto que no solamente hace edificios, sino que es capaz de construir pensamiento dentro de los problemas actuales y globales en los que estamos inmersos. Entonces, mi pregunta va un poco hacia entender cómo ve él el rol actual de un arquitecto que no solamente produce una obra construida, edificios y demás, sino es capaz de influenciar a una sociedad a través del pensamiento. Creo que para mí este es uno de los grandes roles. Creo que están escritos más de 10, 15 libros. Yo tengo hoy en día 5 aquí sobre mi escritorio, los abriendo un poco y entendiendo su gran potencia, más allá de la obra, de construir para los arquitectos un aprender y un saber a pensar.
Well, thank you for that. And again, I appreciate the collaboration that we've had that goes back to Landform Building, and in fact, I would even say that your library in Medellin was fundamental in the constructing the idea for Landform Building. So, I think your question is a very important one for me, obviously, as an educator, a writer, and an architect. I would say two things. I mean, first of all, in relationship to the difference between writing and designing, for me, they're very much parallel. What I disagree with is the idea that somehow theory comes first and practice comes later. For me, in fact, it's often very much the opposite, that you write something down in order to clarify something that you've done in practice. And writing and designing are different technologies in a way, different ways of thinking. I think they employ different parts of your brain. I see the two operating very much on a parallel course. That having been said, I mean, first of all, I would also say that the people in the field that I admire the most, and someone like Rafael Moneo that I worked with in Spain many years ago now, are figures who have written a lot and contributed to the discourse of the discipline, but also contributed to the built aspect of the discipline. And somebody like Rafael has been very thoughtful about the relationship, again, between the two, never confusing the two, in other words, right? But I think we also operate in a world in which when I was going to school, I think the world of the academy and the world of the discipline were very separate. And perhaps I looked to Europe a little bit, and and see maybe that there's a little bit of a closer relationship. I don't know if that's necessarily true anymore, but certainly was the case 30 years ago. But I think being an architect today involves very often teaching, writing, exhibiting, publishing. These are all parts of the activity of the architect. And again, even if we look, deep in history, the architects of the Renaissance who wrote treatises as well as built buildings, as well as made drawings. That I have a very broad definition of what constitutes the practice of the architect. But I would say that writing, teaching, publishing, I do all of those things as an architect, not as as distinct ways of working and thinking.
Thank you, Stan. Bueno, antes de seguir con las preguntas de nuestros relatores, quisiera pasarle, Stan, alguna de las preguntas que nos están llegando de oyentes, de gente que nos está viendo a través de nuestras redes, en YouTube, en Facebook. Stan, I'm going to take a question from some of our viewers on YouTube, which they are asking right in the chat. They're watching it live on YouTube. Patricia Vargas me pide que le pregunte por la incidencia de la luz natural al interior, si pudiera elaborar un poco sobre el tema de la luz en sus trabajos. Stan, I don't know if you got the question. They're asking about the incidence of natural light, and if you can elaborate a little bit on light.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think if we have a kind of expanded notion of what constitutes nature, natural light is of course part of that. Again, it's that notion of seeing nature not as a sort of pictorial thing, something that's out there that we look at, but rather something that surrounds us. So, the air we breathe, the light that makes it possible to function in the world. So yeah, that's, I think, always been very important to me. And of course, you will have understood that the work that is collected in situated objects, one of the other things that ties it together is that beginning with the house and studio in around 2012, I've developed working relationships with artists who are working in that area. So it's a felicitous coincidence that the clients that I'm working with, painters, primarily painters actually, some sculptors, themselves prefer natural light. So although the one exception to that, interestingly enough, is the very first studio. I don't know if you remember the one photograph of the interior of the studio with a very elaborate grid of lights on the ceiling, because she actually likes to control the light. So I will certainly defer to a client if a client prefers to have light that is more controllable. But my preferred light is always natural light. And again, it gives an opportunity, I think, for architectural and tectonic invention. Dealing with the skylights of the Olana project, for example, bringing light in indirectly, having an idea about the relationship between the changing light over the course of the day or even the course of the seasons, that will change the quality of the space as a property of the natural light.
Thank you, Stanley. Bueno, nos quedan minutos todavía, nos quedan todavía tiempo suficiente. Lucas, adelante con Stan, y creo que nos queda tiempo también para otra pregunta de Giancarlo. Vamos a hacerlo así rápidamente para que ambos puedan preguntar y cerramos nuestro conversatorio de hoy. Adelante.
Estupendo, muchísimas gracias. Stan, yo creo que en la introducción de la sesión de hoy pone sobre la mesa y en toda la presentación, para mí, digamos, sigues ahondando un poco en esta cuestión, pero pone sobre la mesa un tema que creo que es crucial, ¿no? Este entender a lo mejor el paisaje como una de las posibles relaciones entre la cultura y la naturaleza, ¿no? Un poco. Entonces, en este mundo en el que vivimos, ¿no? En donde cada vez parece que trazar línea es más difícil, ¿no? Porque todo lo artificial se quiere naturalizar o toda la naturaleza se siente como muy doméstica, ¿no? Y muy artificial. Estando en Colombia, como estamos gran parte de nosotros, digamos, con esta naturaleza poderosísima, con estas culturas tan propias, tan genuinas, ¿cómo manejar esto? O sea, ¿cómo incorporar esto en procesos creativos sin terminar afectando, pues yo creo que siempre la afectamos, pero sin terminar afectándola demasiado, digamos?
No, I mean, again, I think this, well, frankly, for me, this is the fundamental question of the 21st century. I mean, it's a huge generalization, but I would say the dominant intellectual problem for artists and thinkers of the 20th century was human beings' relationship to technology. I think the dominant question for the 21st century, we're still early, but I think it's going to be the relationship between human beings and nature. And of course, you know, everybody is familiar now with the term Anthropocene, which speaks to what you're talking about, you know, the huge impact that human beings have had on the natural landscape. You know, there's an island of trash floating around the Pacific that's as big as Texas, right? I mean, it's, you know, and so part of the problem, and, you know, I mean, that is itself part of the problem, right? We can say there's an island of trash as big as Texas floating around the Pacific. That doesn't really mean much to us. We can't imagine how big it is, you know? We know Texas is big, but, you know, we have no concrete sense of what that means. And this is, you know, this is the problem with climate change as well, right? Climate change is a slow moving catastrophe. We you know, we may get, you know, bigger storms and so on, but, you know, we look out and it looks like nature is fine, you know? So here, I think there are two pathways, if you will. And one of them, and, you know, there are many people in our discipline who are doing very important research that can help us as architects to build in ways that have a smaller impact on the planet. That's not necessarily what I do, although you know, again, I think as we're all as responsible professionals, we are doing all that we can and paying attention. But in terms of doing the actual research, I mean, that's, you know, happening at a very high level. I mean, I have a colleague at Princeton who, you know, is doing very complex studies of alternative forms of energy and so on. And, you know, that has to go forward. So on the one hand, there is the collective work of the discipline of research and new materials and recycling and so on, and different forms of, you know, utilizing natural resources and alternative energy sources. But I think what we can do as architects is on the sort of imagination side, that if we can give a new vision of what it means to construct a different relationship to nature, we can help to change the way people understand their relationship to nature. So that's a less measurable plan in a way, but I think that it's what we can contribute as, let's say, cultural workers as much as technical workers. You know, architecture is always technical and cultural. And I think if we can help people imagine the climate crisis, that's a task for us as architects today.
Stanley, thank you very much. Bueno, nos quedan unos pocos minutos. Giancarlo, adelante. Toca pregunta concreta para respuesta concreta, como decimos en la W, para que estemos dentro del tiempo y además porque al final Mauricio nos va a contar lo que sigue mañana y el resto de la semana con estos conversatorios tan interesantes de Arquitectour. Muchas universidades, gente de la academia, me parece esto que vale la pena destacar, muchísima gente de la academia conectada, y les envían un saludo especial de la Universidad Colegio Mayor de Cundinamarca, un estudiante también de la Facultad de Diseño de la Universidad Católica de Colombia, el arquitecto Julio César Villabona, dice que está con sus estudiantes conectados, están en el curso de vacaciones y están conectados, así que mucha gente sacándole provecho a esto. Giancarlo, adelante.
Yo quería hacer una pregunta muy concreta. Cuando uno entiende todo el trabajo de investigación sobre field condition o la idea del paisaje, entiende la arquitectura como un sistema operativo, como algo que opera. Mi pregunta es si esta idea de paisaje también tiene que ver con la construcción y la definición de la idea de identidad en la arquitectura. O sea, cómo el paisaje construye la identidad y los comportamientos de la gente. Entonces me interesa saber un poquito cómo ve él la discusión alrededor de la identidad. Cuando hablamos de identidad estamos hablando qué identifica la arquitectura colombiana, qué identifica la arquitectura americana o la arquitectura europea hoy en día. O sea, ¿qué es para él la identidad?
It's not an easy question.
I know.
So, and I know our time is limited, but yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to this question, you know, in a way, how does landscape shape us? And, you know, when I begin with this larger distinction between Europe and the Americas, and I think I mean, it's certainly not in a singular way because, you know, one has to pay attention to the differences, you know, between North America, Central America, South America. But I think certainly my identity has been shaped by a relationship to the landscape. I think the best architects that I appreciate, whether they're European, Northern European, Southern European, South American, North American, pay attention to the cultural histories that have shaped landscape and the way in which the landscape has then in turn shaped the culture of those different regions.
Well, Stanley, thank you so much for your time, for being here with us today on Arquitectour, this third annual edition. It's been really a pleasure, very interesting conversation, and have a very nice evening.
Thank you. Thank Lucas and Giancarlo for perfect questions. Really gave me something to think about as well.
Thank you. Bueno, y por supuesto hay que agradecer a Construcciones Planificadas, al Grupo Aval. Esta es la W Radio, su máximo aliado. Y Mauricio, quiero regresar con usted para que usted nos cuente qué sigue, porque esto es tan solo la entrada, tan solo es el inicio, pero ¿qué sigue en Arquitectura en esta edición 2021?
Gracias, Andrés, y muchas gracias, Stanley, por esa presentación y esas respuestas que nos ilustran mucho sobre la arquitectura. El día de mañana tendremos al arquitecto paisajista Joao Núñez. Es un gran apasionado del dibujo y la comprensión de los procesos en el mundo. Él funda una compañía en 1989 que se llama ProApp, que ha recibido varios premios nacionales e internacionales. Mañana nos va a dar una amplia cobertura de su trabajo y va a ser muy agradable tener la conversación del día de mañana. Entonces, todos están invitados a que mañana puedan seguirnos con esta presentación. Y igualmente, como ya les dijo Andrés, esto va a estar grabado, todas las presentaciones. El que se perdió la presentación de Stanley la van a tener, digamos, también para poderle repetir. Y muchas gracias a nuestros invitados relatores y nos vemos mañana.
Muchísimas gracias, Mauricio. Gracias a todas las personas que nos acompañaron. Les recuerdo a través del Facebook de la W Radio, de YouTube. A propósito, me dicen que en YouTube uno puede activar el closed caption y así pueden ver la transcripción para quienes quieran leer al mismo tiempo que están Iván presentándolo, pues ahí lo pueden hacer. Todos estos conversatorios quedan wradio.com.co/arquitectur, ahí van a estar también en construccionesplanificadas.com/arquitectur. Acá vamos a estar hasta el 16 de julio, también estará Diana Gil acompañándolos en algunos conversatorios, así que aquí seguimos y qué rico poder hablar un rato de arquitectura en el 2021.